Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of PIOF 2026. My name is Maria, and I'm the director of EUPATI, one of the 3 organizations behind PIOF. And we at EUPATI, we believe that meaningful patient involvement is built on education and training that allows us to understand each other's perspectives. And for me, PIOF is a place of active learning, where we learn about challenges and solutions, we learn about each other, we learn about ourselves, and about the systems that we have built, and about the systems that need to be rebuilt. And last night's rhythm workshop that you also saw on the video also reflected this, as we learned that we can create and co-create rhythm. This takes active listening and curiosity, and sometimes the rhythm changes in a way that we did not expect. So today our learning journey continues, so stay with us in active listening, curious, bring your voice, and expect the unexpected. Now I'm handing over to Neil and his firm hands, and he will take you through this day's plenary. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria. So I hope you had a fantastic time last night. I thought the noise in the room where we were all eating dinner together was just incredible. So it showed just how many conversations were happening just at those dinner tables. And so it's great to see you all here and looking very awake. So I'm very pleased about that. So we're going to be talking today about HTA. But I want us to think about HTA not just as this gatekeeper, if you like, this organization that controls what medicines or medical devices are available to us, but also think about that process of HTA, building on evidence, involving stakeholders, including patient stakeholders in decision-making, thinking about how that could be applied, that process, that approach could be applied much more widely across healthcare systems. As we know, our healthcare systems are struggling. And so as we listen to our panel today, I want you to take a much broader view and think about this not just in terms of health technology assessment as this particular process step that we have, but think about the process of evidence-based decision-making that includes stakeholders, that has patient involvement at its heart. Think about that process and think about what the panel says and take that into the sessions, the co-creation sessions that you will be all engaging in throughout today. But without further ado, I'd like to invite the panel up here as well. And so I'm delighted that we have, I'll wait until our panel are sitting, but I'm delighted that we have such a fantastic panel representing different perspectives, different points of view about the opportunities that we have ahead of us. Yes, there are challenges. There's always challenges. There are things that we need to work on to make things better. But there's also opportunities. There's a way that we together collectively in PIOF and beyond PIOF can think about how we move the agenda forward. And so as I say, we're going to be looking at that through the lens of HTA today. But I want you to think about this, what we listened to today, how it can be applied across many other dimensions of healthcare. So I will go in the order that people are sitting here. So we have Nicolas Garnier from Servier there. We have Clarissa Corbel from ISPOR. We have Anne Single, who is president of HTAI. And we have De Haene from CORD, the Canadian Organization of Rare Diseases. And you'll hear more from them in a moment. So let's start this panel off. I'm going to start with you, Anne. So as president of HTAI, you're very much globe-trotting. You know, you're all around the world listening to HTA stakeholders, and you're also a co-editor of the fantastic book that's just come out on patient involvement in HTA. So what I'd like you to think about or help explain is, where is health technology assessment, where is that field heading? And what does that mean for the evolving role of patient involvement in HTA more broadly?
Thanks, Neil, for that question, and thank you also because you've written some incredible chapters in that book, so we really appreciate that. Look, like everything, health technology assessment, that process that helps us determine the value of a treatment and then whether someone will fund it or reimburse it, it's in a state of change. And one of the things we see is that for a long time we've had a fairly narrow focus in this area, and we're hearing a lot of discussion about changing that. In a way, it's a little like going back to the early days, but you can never really go back, and so we're bringing new knowledge to that. So thinking about, you know, what are the opportunities for using the process to look at broader value, and what are the opportunities for thinking about beyond single technology assessments, so beyond an individual drug to multi-technology to settings. What could that really mean for better outcomes to patients? And so what's the change here in terms of our patient community? The big change I see is the establishment of the idea of patient knowledge. And if you only hear me say two words, and I say them a lot, they will be patient knowledge, because health technology assessment and the processes that look like health technology assessment, they're a knowledge game. Okay, so they're running on that evidence and expertise. And for a very long time, patients have been positioned as interest holders, which is such an understatement, right? But that is the positioning of them. And so we think about introducing a conflict of interest. We think about how we're going to limit them in the process. We think about how we're going to train them for our processes. But if we think about patients as knowledge holders, and if you think about the work of Dumez and L'Esperance in this, where they talked about where patients learn in the self, they learn from engaging with the system, and then you learn from your condition communities. And you form, they defined it as 6 types of knowledge, and you can check that out. But if you think about that knowledge, you start to think about how much it is needed in understanding the value of treatments. And then what we do is we say patients aren't interest holders, they're knowledge holders. So then the system must learn how to learn that knowledge. So it's not all about training patients and about determining conflicts of interest. It's about opening up and working out how can the system learn from this knowledge. 2 quick other things, can I sneak in?
Of course.
Great. So another thing we're seeing in that place, if you've ever looked at a health technology assessment organisation's engagement program, has anyone seen an explicit goal for the engagement program in a health technology assessment? It is a trick question. I don't see them very often, and I'm just giving feedback on the Australian one, saying, where is the goal? Because if the goal is not to learn from patient knowledge, then how are we going to measure the impact? And Neil, you're involved in some great work now around impact, but one of the hardest challenges, apart from the lack of transparency, is how do you measure impact if you don't know the goal? So that's another area. The final thing I'd like to raise is by elevating patient knowledge and recognising it for the knowledge base that it is essential to good healthcare, we can actually start to think about how our biases against all forms of knowledge prevent us from learning. And I hope as patient communities that will actually take us to learn better from each other, from different cultural settings, and instead of thinking, oh, the country X is not as well established as we are further along the path and missing the chance to learn. We might start to think country X is on a different path to us. What can I learn from their knowledge base? So it's an exciting time for how are we going to know and where are we going to go?
Yeah, and I love that framing about opening up, really. So opening up around patient knowledge, but opening up to each other globally to learn as much as we can from each other across the stakeholder groups as well. And so with that in mind, I'm wondering, I'm going to go to you, Nicola, I'm wondering, in Europe, we've now had for a year and a bit now, this new European process, HTA process, called the Joint Clinical Assessment. And I know you've been observing what's been happening there and thinking about that. So where we are today, what are we learning, or what is the industry learning, what are other stakeholders learning from this joint clinical assessment process? And what is being revealed as that process is playing out? So there's very European focus, but if you can give us that point of view, that'd be great. Thanks, Nicola.
Yes, absolutely, and thank you. It is still very early days, right? It's fair to say that we're actually sitting on the verge of a new era for HTA assessment, and that impacts the whole process. With that reform, joint clinical assessment, the emergence of the PICO, so on and so forth. But it brings also a lot of uncertainty. So there will be change, and hopefully in the right direction, but uncertainty because we can see what it's supposed to do, hopefully accelerate the whole process and reduce inefficiencies, which is good. But at the end of the process, we'll have to see exactly what it looks like. In the same time, in 2025, 2026, we saw many decision makers updating their patient experience data guidance, which is good. So that is a signal. Decision makers are saying, yes, we want to look at patient knowledge. We want to include that in the decision-making process. And here's how, here's the expectation. Although it's a lot on the regulatory side, a little less on the HTA side. So again, we have to assume that it will work for both. And hopefully that can reduce a bit of the uncertainty, right? So the expectation for patient engagement is shifting as well from maybe storytelling and testimonials and lived experience, which is tremendously important. And now decision makers are saying, you need to turn that into data and what someone called yesterday, I believe, evidence-based advocacy, so that we can have evidence-based decision making. But how do we manage that as a community? We're probably looking at a bubble ahead of us, a bubble in the need to generate that patient experience data, these patient preference studies. So it asks two questions then. Capability, right? So a lot of people, probably in this room and beyond, will need to understand and shape up frameworks, harmonizations, and processes for patient experience data, but also capacity. Capacity, because in the end of the day, it's people that will work on that, and can the output meet the demand of all the dossiers? That's a question. And hopefully one of the answers is collaboration. Collaboration, which is the theme of this conference, right? Collaboration, making sure that as much as possible, all of that work is done in the collaborative space. That's one way to address capacity, and also a way to address harmonization, best practices, and predictability, which is what everybody wants and everybody needs.
Thanks for that, Nicola. And so when I think about that, we as a community have a real opportunity ahead to work out how we collaborate and learn around things like patient experience data. What sort of evidence do we need to put forward that is really exemplifying the knowledge that Anne was talking about as well? And I know from my own perspective, when the JCA, the Joint Clinical Assessment, was first announced, we were really worried that it would just sit in a box and not get used at the national level. And just one really positive piece of information in Spain, there's new legislation going through at the moment looking to refine their HTA process. And it's actually mandating that that process starts by using the Joint Clinical Assessment report where it's available. So we're starting to see a movement happening where at the national level, countries are responding to this European process, which is exactly what we hoped would happen. But you're right, thinking about the evidence that's needed for that process will be critical. And we're sort of building the plane as we're flying it, aren't we? Because we don't actually know what evidence is going to be needed until we're in the process. So that's the unknown, isn't it, Nicola?
That's right.
Yes. So Dehane, I want to move on to you now and sort of think, you know, your work, a bit like Anne, you're globetrotting. You're seeing different systems, you know, through the lens of the rare disease community. You're seeing countries where they are only just starting on this journey of having formal HTA processes, formal patient involvement processes. So what do you think, to answer Anne's question, what do you think we can learn from what you're seeing around the world?
So thank you very much and it's great following what Anne and Nicholas said. Though I will make one quick comment. You know, yesterday, day before coming in, we were in a plane that announced they had a technical problem. So we're turned around from coming into this field back into Zurich, and I do not want us to build the plane as we're flying it. That was not a good idea. So I'm really happy we didn't try to fix it while we were in mid-flight. But just to say, really want to thank you very much. And I really want to speak, as Neil said, perspective. I'm from Canada. I'm president of CORT there, but also president of the Asia Pacific Alliance of Rare Disease Organizations. So I'm going to speak a little bit from that perspective, rare, and from low middle income, some of the emerging countries. And just to say that I think, you know, a principle we all share is that, you know, in every society you have to make choices with, you know, very limited resources often. And so we're talking about food, we're talking about housing, we're talking about education or health. So the goal is, how do we do the most good for the most people, recognizing, of course, that we can't solve everything. But we also want to do it as fairly as possible. But I think the difference in health is that people don't choose illness, and oftentimes, of course, illness has catastrophic consequences. So we have to think a little bit different about that in terms of how do we make sure that those who are the least able to negotiate also are treated fairly. So recognizing no healthcare system, I don't care how advanced your country is, can provide everything to everybody. But we do have to make sure that in health, we're going to try to avoid what we call avoidable inequity. And we want to protect people from catastrophic loss. And we want to create fair processes. So, I mean, that's why HTA has been so important. I think I've been involved with HTA for 2.5 decades now. And it brought evidence, as Anne talked about, it brought transparency, discipline into decisions that at one point, you know, were often seen as somewhat arbitrary, or they were very politically driven, right? So it's been great that way. So not arguing against HTA, but I think what we're now needing to ask is, do the HTA models, as Anne has actually indicated, and that Nicholas was talking about, most developed in Europe, in UK, and for highly developed countries, are they the right models to copy, especially when we talk about the Asia Pacific countries, where access pathways are still being built? I mean, some of those countries, and we just produced the Asian Declaration on Rare Diseases, we're still trying to access essential medicines. We're trying to get access to basic diagnostics. We're trying to get access to specialist care, basic standards of treatment. So in that kind of a context, I have to ask the question, isn't it illogical to actually spend sparse patient, professional health system, government capacity on complex HTA processes, which are increasingly complex, on processes don't actually create access? What I like to say is that we shouldn't build the gate before we actually build the road. So what do we want to do? I think APEC is a wonderful opportunity because our systems are just evolving. And we don't have to copy HTA as a one-time gatekeeping mechanism. What we can do is we can design multiple access systems, a bit of what Anne also was speaking to. you know, a traditional population-based HTA process really says no to a lot of things, and we experience it in high-income countries, right? Just because the evidence is incomplete, the price is too high, and for some patients, there is no alternative. And of course, the potential benefit could be profound. So what are we going to do? The question isn't, is this therapy cost effective for broad reimbursement today, which is kind of what HTA is asking us. The question is there a responsible way that we can provide access? And as I think, Nicholas is also talking about, can we learn from the use? Can we manage the budget risk? Can we reassess over time? So what we're saying is that there are many pathways to access, and that we should actually acknowledge those legitimately. There's compassionate access that we already have, named patient access, we have conditional approvals, managed entry agreements, we have price negotiations, we have budget counts, we have patient registries, real-world evidence, and clear start-stop rules. And what we can also have is a single pathway that can actually be not just ad hoc or politically driven, but it can also be based on transparent criteria. It's based on serious need. There's no reasonable alternative. Plausible benefit, shared responsibility, data capture, and accountability, but it's a separate pathway. And that's again where I think patients and patient organizations are so important, because we're not only here, I think, as we said, to provide stories and to actually be able to make submissions to HTA. What we're doing now is to actually involve patients in defining what is meaningful benefit. We have to start there. I think we should, what are the goals? What is the meaningful benefit for patients? Identify who's likely to benefit, document real-world outcomes, report treatment budgets, et cetera. So the patients, in some respects, we train the patients, and I appreciate very much how are patients engaged in HTA. That's not the question, really. The question is not how do we fit into the process, how do we redesign the process? How do we actually empower patients to create different access pathways that are based on other kinds of criteria? And how can we also, in a case in which we're looking at broad societal needs, recognize urgency, uncertainty, the ethical importance, and that we don't abandon patients just because they don't fit into conventional access models? So I'll stop in a second. I'll just give you 4 quick comments that I want to make. 1, HTA is a tool. It is not the access system. In Asia Pacific, other emerging countries, we should sequence priorities, start with the essential medicines, make sure they're there, create pragmatic HT for a broader range, but also keep those unique pathways for highly technical, urgent needs. Equity is not the same as sameness, and that we can have a system that has many pathways, including exceptional pathways, recognizing that, in fact, we have different needs, we have different kinds of therapies. And fourthly, most importantly for us, is patient capacity building. We've got to go way beyond submissions, which I know we're all talking about, but we need not only skills in terms of, as you say, translating our experience and generating evidence, but we really have to be involved in redesigning and providing different kinds of system pathways. So I think what we're saying is that certainly for emerging countries, but even for countries like Canada, we don't need to abandon evidence, we don't need to abandon cost effectiveness, but we don't need to do, especially in countries like in APAC, we don't need to mistakenly import HTA as an access strategy.
Thank you, Jehan. So it's a really good reminder that HTA is very different from country to country, and access pathways may not include HTA in some circumstances, and that's important to notice. I remember I read a piece of research, it's from Canada, in rare disease treatments, and they looked at, I think, 120 rare disease treatments that had been approved in Canada, and they wanted to say, I think it was in Ottawa or one of the provinces, they wanted to say, how did that pan out? How did the HTA decision impact access? And they found that in over 1/3 of cases, the HTA body said no, but it was still provided in that province because there were other political schemes to provide money to enable access, even though the HTA had said no. And so it's a real reminder that across different countries, we have additional routes for access alongside or around HTA. But Clarissa, I want to turn to you now. You've been globetrotting as well. So you're just hot on the heels of your ISPOR conference in the United States. And I thought it'd be really useful for you to give us almost like a bigger picture view of sort of what's happening out there, what's changing in terms of the global policy landscape, the frameworks, if you like, the norms that we've been living with in healthcare systems for decades are changing at the moment. So I'd like you to reflect on when we're in structural change, when those norms that we're used to are being challenged, how do you think that that changes how we need to adapt in healthcare systems, but also in patient involvement? And particularly, what does that mean for the evidence that we might need to be generating?
Well, good morning, everyone. That's a loaded question. I'm so happy to be here. Clarissa Kublal, Senior Director of Scientific Initiatives at ISPOR. This is my third PIOF, so very happy to see some familiar faces. Yeah, like I said, Neil, that's a loaded question on just coming off of ISPOR. There's a wealth of information that came from that conference, including the recent MFN policy that I think we're all aware of. And for the young lady yesterday on acronyms, there are a lot of acronyms. So I do realize there are some probably patients in the room or individuals who may not know about MFN, and that's Most Favored Nation. And that's a recent international trade policy. So I won't say that it's a domestic policy, but it's essentially a policy that's going to affect a lot of access to medicines, innovation, driving the costs. Is that going to be more affordable for patients in the US? And do the rest of the world, what the impacts for that will be? So lots of conversations last night at dinner and throughout the different sessions, from just hearing from different patients as well as industry partners, how everyone's grasping this aspect. So I just want to encourage those conversations to keep happening, because we don't know what the long-term impacts will be. Obviously in the US, we're hopeful that we will have cheaper medications for the patients at the end of the day, but we don't know what those out-of-pocket costs will be. So I just want to address that from the start, because I know that was a very hot topic at the ISPOR conference a couple of weeks ago. On the broader scheme of things, so I do work with our scientific initiatives team at ISPOR, and we all oversee a lot of content that comes across the board. We have about 10,000 patients across 110 countries right now in our membership, and we cover a multitude of topics, all the way from patient-centeredness all the way to real-world evidence. And what does that mean? We're now looking at how to have integrated evidence planning and access. So talking about the gate, what does that look like when you are developing your plan? What does that look like for the decision maker as well as the patient very early on? And oftentimes that access plan is missing from the gate, and I think that's a real opportunity for those in the room as well as online. Actually, we do have some people dialing in, so don't want to forget about them. But how does that look for patients to be embedded into the process very early on? And I think oftentimes we talk about HTA, but that's so much further down in the process that it would be much easier if the integrated evidence was thought out at the start on how we were incorporating those perspectives. I will say, as part of our new strategic plan 2030, we are focusing on expanding the broader definition of value assessment. So what are those value elements that are missing from the equation right now? We are looking to expand on the whole health approach, and you may have heard this yesterday in one of our sessions, but we've built out a definition that is really underway and through refinement, because we strongly believe there are domains that are currently missing from our value assessment. So looking at mental, environmental, physical, social, and behavioral health domains, and how does that fit into the cost and outcomes equation, because that's clearly missing from a traditional cost effectiveness analysis. So lots of work being done right now behind the scenes, but hopefully throughout the year we will be putting out more information ISPOR has over 79 task forces at this point, which are good practice reports. Most recently, our patient preference reports were cited in the recent FDA patient preference document. So we really do feel strongly about the evidence that we're creating and the robust and the rigor that those task forces do develop. So I'm going to pause there because I know that's a lot of information, but open to many questions.
But I think that's a really good lens. We talk about evidence and patient engagement, patient involvement, almost like they're two separate things. And I think what you're saying, Clarissa, is that there's a real opportunity to think about this integrated evidence approach. How does that work with patient engagement? What is the role of patient engagement in shaping and developing that evidence? And how do we ensure, back to Anne's point, that that is reflecting the patient knowledge that's needed in various decision-making contexts, such as HTA. And so I think there's an opportunity for us all, over the next few days as we're in our co-creation sessions, to think about that, think about how we pull together these different strands in a cohesive narrative, for want of a better term, and how do we avoid duplication there? So some really good points for us to take forward in our thinking. They've got a few more minutes and then we'll open this up to Q&A for you all. But for each of you, thinking about these concepts of learning from each other, learning from different regions, being clear about this difference between patient knowledge and having an interest. If we could move in that direction and build the evidence that's needed along the way as we move there, what do you think the world could look like in terms of healthcare decision-making, say 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And I'll start with you, Anne, on this one.
Don't I? Sorry. I was just, excuse me. What I would hope it looks like, and I hope this isn't too abstract, but when I think about patient knowledge, I think, where does patient knowledge come from? It comes from perhaps receiving a diagnosis or experiencing symptoms and starting to have questions forming. And then you go and look and you get some knowledge from clinical knowledge from the health system, but you get the rest of the knowledge that you're out there hunting for. And so I always come back to questions. What might the system look like? Because what determines the current evidence base is the questions we ask, and that then results in the outcomes that are reached. But where can we go with developing and really giving space for the sorts of questions patients ask earlier in the system? And if I had to look for one thing, it would be an indication that we're starting to change the questions we're asking. So I hope that's not too abstract, but that's sort of what I'm hoping we'll see, because then I think we'll start to get this different knowledge in. And I want to be really open about all this, because I actually think that despite the years of looking at patient knowledge, there are some areas where we really have not been looking, or maybe not even listening when we look. So.
What kind of areas? Can you give me an example?
Okay, I'm particularly thinking about the area of community. So I think we're quite good, good's a strong word, I think sometimes we do really well in the areas that are closest to clinical knowledge. So the sorts of knowledge that comes from listening to your body and experiencing and monitoring. I think we also can do quite well with listening to patients' experience knowledge gained from interacting with the system. But I think this idea that patients have a life outside of the clinical area is not surprising but underexplored. And I think that the cultural norms and knowledge building in communities of conditions is incredibly powerful. If I could give an example, we're working on a project in Australia, and I wanted to say, look, the knowledge you're looking for is in a closed group. That's where it lies. You can't just search the internet for it. And the team was really shocked by this, and they said, well, how do you know that a person from industry hasn't got into the group and feeding good results from a trial so that everyone's getting excited. And okay, that could happen, but if you know online community groups, as many of you will, people get kicked out, right? Because you build your credibility by your personal knowledge, and if you don't have personal knowledge, you stand out like a sore thumb. So that's the kind of area where we just haven't even started to delve into what people are learning amongst themselves, that the health system hasn't had space to listen and learn from.
To look at those wider questions
Yeah.
and monitor what's really happening on the ground.
Yeah.
Good point. Nicola, I'll come to you now. So 5-10 years from now, what do you hope to see?
Well, you mentioned two concepts, patient knowledge, patient involvement, but then you also said decision making, and these are different. So I think it's fair to say that we can all hope that we can change on both fronts. And we need to be very careful because the new expressed welcoming need for patient data, patient experience, and patient knowledge doesn't turn into yet another way to keep patients on the periphery of where the decisions are made and when they are made. What I hear a lot is patients saying, it's great that we're consulted, that is progress, but it's far from enough. You can be consulted, but you also need to be at the table taking part in the decisions that ultimately impacts patients and their families. So we need progress on both fronts. And it takes knowledge, it takes capability building, right, to be able to take part of those decisions. It also takes policy change and progress so that we can truly have participative medicine, not just as a pious hope, but as something actually built into the systems infrastructure that govern global health, so that it is more credible and more sustainable, as Joanne was saying.
So it's building that infrastructure, it's building processes that integrate patients much more into the decision making. And this came up briefly in the panel discussion, is also that transparency around when decisions are made or recommendations made, is how has the patient input shaped that recommendation? And I think that's sometimes too much of a black box as well. So
That's
it's
right.
thinking through that.
That's right, and we need a lot more harmonization.
Yeah.
Yes, countries are different. Yes, there are localities, regionalities, cultural, structural, so on and so forth, and it needs to be accounted for. How can we address a little bit more all of the uncertainties? Maybe one way to do that is some level of harmonization. We were chatting before about the Orbis procedure when it comes to regulatory processes, and I believe it's demonstrated tremendously valuable. Yeah. So maybe one might think that something along those lines for the HTA process of harmonization could be also very useful, and push a little bit more global health and equity.
Yeah, I hope so too. Dehane, what's your view on the future?
Well, I think I go the other way. And I think we're increasingly asking countries to harmonize to Europe, harmonize to high income standards. And I say over and over again, low middle income countries are not to grow up to be high income countries. It's not, doesn't work that way. And the more we are creating pathways that are imposed to say, I mean, you know, this is the way to do it. But even in high income countries, your example there is an amazing one. 100 and some rare disease drugs, 30 of them picked out of the systems, but we brought them back in. That was a waste. It was a waste the fact that we put them into the system to begin with in terms of HTA. It was a waste that we didn't actually recognize what that need was and that people had to get involved as advocates and be able to do hardcore, kind of one-offs. And I'm not even sure that 30% was necessarily the fairest 30%. That's not it. We need to create those as legitimate pathways. And I use a quick example, and there's a number of people here from the Philippines who know a lot better than I do, but when we were recently last year in the Philippines, 10 new therapies came in for rare diseases in the Philippines. They did not come through HTA, and they would never have gotten there exactly that way. 6 of them recognized as essential medicines. The health secretary says, yes, it's time we brought them in high unmet need. 4 of them were based on long processes in which there was a compassionate program built up with an infrastructure to say, okay, the time is right now. We need to take them over. We need to look at these alternative pathways in terms of what we've done. If I look at Taiwan, the majority of the drugs in that rare disease system did not come through HTA. And in fact, when HTA was brought in and imposed on the rare disease system, the drug flow stopped. And the community protests and basically say, excuse us, we need to step outside of HTA to get our patients access. And what I'm saying is let's legitimize those. Let's look at those kinds of pathways. And they're not just, as I say, for LMICs, but they have to look at the type of drug. So yeah, I get the harmonization. Yes, we benefit a whole lot from having much more rigor and having much more transparency. But again, we're wasting not only time and resources, we're wasting patients' lives. I mean, I don't know how many of that 30% in which patients were terribly adversely affected before they finally said, okay, we need to make an exception. It should have never been an exception. So I'm really arguing for many alternative pathways. My last comment is for Clarissa. Once upon a time, ISPOR was not about HTA. And now I go to ISPOR, and I might as well be at an HTAI event. It is so much HTA. It's got to go back to 9 of those 12 petals on that value will never be assessed by HTA. Let's legitimize how we look at those other values and make them really a part of the process.
So Clarissa, that's a challenge.
Over to you.
So that's a challenge, Clarissa. So taking on that challenge, but also thinking about the opportunities you see going forward, how do you pull that together?
Well, I mean, great comments from everyone. I like the harmonization aspect of it, but I do recognize that there's different value, how everyone sees value differently, whether you're in one country or another. But I think patient to patient and person to person, your value elements are just different. So I will see that as a complexity to harmonize. But I was reading recently about UK, NICE, and Taiwan renewing their agreement. So there are opportunities to learn from other HTA bodies that are doing better and can provide that type of input. So I feel like that's more of a learning culture that people should be reaching out that way. As far as my 5 to 10 year goal, I do recognize ISPOR's vision that is very bold. It is a world where healthcare is affordable, accessible, effective, and efficient for all. Not sure we'll get there in 10 years, but it is a vision statement. And we are actively working on that. And I think the healthcare system was built for sick care versus healthcare. And maybe that will be the change over time with looking at different value elements and focusing on the health and well-being of a person. I think someone used people empowered yesterday, so maybe it's a shift from patient empowerment to people empowerment, and you're taking a stance on your well-being instead of just your disease area. So that's my hope for the future.
The whole health system instead of a sickness system. Yes, yes. We all hope that that's what we can achieve. So you've heard from the panel, you've heard all of these different perspectives. So let's hear from you now. Any questions for the panel? Any thoughts? I can see hands going up. Loda. It's coming.
This is a joint question. Firstly, nice to meet you all. My name is Tara Wisham from Novartis. It was great to hear such a great panel discussion, and we really appreciate your thoughts and discussion. We are going through the conversation, especially as you think about the future of HTA, and Anne, as you highlighted there, a new era of HTA. What are your thoughts on AI as part of it? And how do you see the community really, I suppose, embracing or understanding or looking at AI to, I suppose, lean into this capability and capacity point you made earlier? And how do you see it as a driving force to kind of close the gaps in that advocacy or evidence advocacy piece?
Oh, AI, yeah, it's not been mentioned. I'm going to go to Anne.
No, and I'll try to condense it, and I hope we can talk more about this. So obviously we see so many potential impacts, and where are we seeing the HTA bodies looking at this? So at our policy forums, our global policy forum in 2025, January, that was the focus. We all felt a bit naive still. Some companies were very developed in their AI, but generally the system was a bit naive. And then we just met in Costa Rica last month for the LATAM Policy Forum, and I felt like you could feel the roar of AI coming through. And Neil will co-chair our Global Policy Forum next year, and we'll reflect a little bit on what's changed. But in the meantime, we'll go to Asia, we'll go to Japan in November, and we'll look at AI in that environment. So what are the sorts of things we're seeing? I think one of the things, perhaps won't surprise you, HTA bodies are seeing where they can be proportionate and have greater efficiency in the system. So that's a real driver in it. Another real driver, which is near and dear to me, is how can we get more robust, more evidence efficiently? And then how can HTA bodies be sure that we're ready for that environment? And that's where being, I think, a multi-stakeholder society can be so valuable for having those discussions. And then one thing that I think really sets up something like health technology assessment for this era where everything can feel a bit like mining data some days, is that health technology assessment is not just the evidence coming through. As we've talked about it should have deliberation with it, and we tend to focus just on that final deliberation at the appraisal committee, and sometimes people describe it as patching the holes, and sometimes it's a really robust discussion. It just varies around the world. But behind the idea of health technology assessment is regular dialogue, deliberation, and I think that's going to be incredibly important for how we look at AI coming through, keeping that human oversight to say, okay, on what basis do we now know that, and what does that mean for our communities? Yeah.
Just a quick comment on the AI and HTA front. There is a recent generative AI in HTA working group manuscript that I could share with you that would probably be very helpful, but it's looking at the challenges and opportunities of generative AI and HTA and what different terms are acceptable to be using in the process.
Just to add very quickly, really, like what you're saying, is that one of the things we're trying to use AI for is not to make a decision, but to do much more rapid, much more evidence-engaged what-if scenarios. What if we went down this path? What if we went down this path? What if we did here? And to be able to extrapolate out for us 5, 10 years, what would that look like? And because AI can handle a lot of complex information, it doesn't make a decision, it just gives you, I think, better information. And it also has a couple of times really helped us understand if we leave out something, the results can be totally different. So it gives you an opportunity to think about, okay, what are we not paying attention to?
So to add to that, I think AI holds tremendous promise, and I will actually even throw in the mix quantum computing, right, which is also coming. To deal with maybe some of the uncertainties, more granular analysis. How can we accurately and reliably capture the human experience and attribute value to hope, which is one of the things we discussed yesterday for patients. So maybe AI can help with that. However, we need to be careful, and we can learn from past mistakes. When technological revolution arrives, we tend to oversell it and overpromise. It has the opposite effect of what we hope, which is it scares people. Let's think back 10, 20 years ago when it was the advent of genomics and genomic medicine, and everybody said that it was going to solve everything. All we needed was your genomic data, and it scared people away. And now we're having tremendous difficulties reuniting people and communities with genetics and genomics and actually using it how we could. So let's not make the same mistake with AI. Let's look at it for what it is. Let's make sure that decisions stay driven by human intelligence. And to do that collectively, we need to focus on health literacy. We need to focus on digital literacy and data literacy so that it's not a foreign magical concept of AI. It's very difficult to trust something that you don't understand, that is new and oversold. And again, we can learn from past mistakes and hopefully take that turn a lot more efficiently this time.
So we need to take it a step at a time with our eyes wide open and look for the opportunities, but also be quite critical and think about what this means. I'm going to say we have time. We don't really, but I'm going to say we do. Time for one more question. Yep.
Hi, good morning, and thank you, everyone. Great comments. Couldn't agree more. At what point in this conversation do we bring in and acknowledge the perspective that says that this is risky? Thinking about the corporate side, where a lot of the data and integrated evidence plans are coming in to HTA, to approval processes. How do we acknowledge the fear of whether you call it coercion or kickback or false hope, whatever is getting in the way of the adoption of everything that we're saying here?
So can I just understand the question a little bit more? So is it that we have all this data coming in, we have all things like AI?
Well, Neil, it's that, at least on the industry side, there is perception that, yes, patients have value in terms of informing the decisions that we make, but we can't go too far because we don't want to risk perceptions of coercion, perceptions of kickbacks, perceptions of there's too much risk to have patients be as integral to the conversation as we are all advocating for here today. How do we at least acknowledge that in our storyline?
Okay, so this balancing I suppose it's the interest element here and the connection between patients and industry and how that can sometimes be seen as a barrier to decision making.
We have no new answers, but I think one of the things we always say is transparency. You can't actually eliminate people that are going to totally violate and get away with it, as we all know. But on the other hand, if we can be as upfront as possible, and we can acknowledge it as possible, part of the reason we have these kinds of challenges, right, is that we will not be willing to acknowledge that, yes, we get a lot of information from industry, and we rely on it. We get a lot of information from other professionals, and we have to rely on it, and that the other parts of it get information from the patients. So it is a matter, for me, it's like, the more we can be totally transparent and accepting of the fact that we are all sort of stakeholders in it. We have different interests, we have different needs in it, but we can acknowledge kind of what and how we're working together. I know it sounds a little bit, kind of like a truism or Pollyannish, but that's about the only way I can think about how do we do it. We just shine lights on it.
Okay. Very brief comment, Anne, and then we'll...
Very briefly, I want to acknowledge that risk, and I'd love to have a whole session where we sit with that. But I also want to say, when you get down to HTA and you can't see that the industry involved patients earlier, and it's not, we would love to know what was the methodology, how did you do it, and how did you find, because in countries like Australia, I sometimes see over here that patients were involved in something, and by the time it lands on our HTA desk, we can't see it, and we can undo good work in our patient communities because we can't see. So that transparency point is super important.
Transparency. So that approach keeps coming up. I want you to think about everything that we've been talking about today in terms of what you're going to be looking at throughout the rest of today. And so I think there might be a slide up showing the sessions coming up next. There you go. So, you know, patient experience data, we've touched on that today. Think about real-world evidence. As we get bigger, better data sets with patients involved in processes, what does that look like? What does our collaboration look like? What can we learn across the globe? Dehane was really telling us that we need to think beyond HTA sometimes and think of other access pathways. They require evidence too. They're not a free ride. So what kind of evidence do we produce? What kind of involvement do we need in those other access pathways? So as we think about all that today, reflect on these ideas, including things like patient knowledge, including the evidence that we can jointly develop together, and take that into your sessions. But I would really like to thank the panel today. It's been so excellent to get these views. All that remains is to say, really dig in, roll your sleeves up, and get going for the rest of the sessions today.